For decades, the Japanese state has essentially defied the laws of economic gravity. It has maintained the absolute highest debt-to-gross domestic product (GDP) ratio in the developed world. By the end of March 2025, the general gross debt of the Japanese government stood at an incomprehensible 1,324 trillion yen. That is 1.3 quadrillion yen. That equates to roughly 235% of the country's entire economic output. To put that in perspective, the European Union starts heavily penalizing its member states when their debt breaches just 60%. By every textbook, every classical economic paradigm, and every historical precedent ever written, a nation carrying a debt burden of this astronomical magnitude should be a hyperinflated, post-apocalyptic financial wasteland. Its currency should be worthless paper. Yet, reality tells an entirely contradictory story. Japan remains the fourth largest economy on Earth. Its trains run perfectly on time. Its infrastructure is pristine. Its society is highly developed, deeply peaceful, and, until very recently, operating with a near-zero inflation rate. Japan didn't collapse. It just kept borrowing. Now, look right next door. If you evaluate Beijing's official sovereign debt, the structure looks incredibly responsible. It represents a mere fraction of Japan's burden. By the end of 2022, China's total official government debt sat at roughly 96 trillion yuan, or approximately 13.9 trillion US dollars. That equates to a government debt-to-GDP ratio of just 68.5%. Furthermore, the central government in Beijing held only 43% of that official debt. When you compare that to the G7 average of 123%, China's official debt ledger appears pristine. It looks like the most financially disciplined superpower on the planet. Yet, if you ask anyone in the global financial system what keeps them awake at night, they aren't looking at Japan. They are looking at China. The global economic community continually stress tests the stability of the Chinese financial architecture, fearing a catastrophic, systemic collapse, while largely shrugging at Japan's multi-quadrillion yen ledger. Why? How can a country with 235% debt be considered a safe haven, while a country with 68% debt is teetering on the edge of a banking crisis? Because in the world of sovereign economics, not all debt is created equal. The raw numbers on the ledger are an optical illusion. To understand this trillion-dollar paradox, we have to stop looking at how much money these countries owe. Instead, we have to look at who they owe it to, the shadowy, invisible mechanisms they use to borrow it, and the decaying concrete assets they actually bought with it. When you pull back the curtain, you discover that Japan's debt operates as a perfectly controlled, heavily fortified, closed-loop domestic machine. China's financial system, however, is propped up by a massive decentralized, subterranean shadow economy that is currently threatening to pull the entire country into a deflationary black hole. This is the story of two empires, two mountains of money, and the brutal demographic clock that is ticking loudly behind both of them. The mathematical impossibility of Japan's survival starts with a crash. To understand why Japan owes 1.3 quadrillion yen, you have to rewind to the early 1990s. In the 1980s, Japan was the unquestioned economic miracle of the world. It experienced arguably the greatest asset bubble in human history. Real estate prices reached such absurd heights that the grounds of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo were theoretically worth more than all the real estate in the entire state of California combined. But in 1991, the bubble violently burst. Japan entered a prolonged period of economic stagnation universally known as the lost decades. GDP growth flatlined. Private companies stopped borrowing, stopped spending, and focused entirely on paying down their massive debts. Consumers panicked and hoarded their cash. When the private sector stops spending, a country's economy will collapse into a depression unless someone else steps in to buy things. So, the Japanese government stepped in. They became the spender of last resort. They paved roads, built massive bridges, and expanded social welfare just to keep the economy moving. By the early 2000s, the Bank of Japan pioneered radical, non-traditional monetary policies, specifically quantitative easing. They essentially began printing money to buy government debt, desperately trying to encourage economic growth and fight off persistent deflation. By 2013, Japanese public debt had crossed the incomprehensible 1 quadrillion yen threshold. Japan's sovereign debt market operates as a highly fortified, hermetically sealed, closed loop. When emerging markets, like Argentina, Sri Lanka, or Turkey, go bankrupt, it is usually because they are forced to borrow money in foreign currencies from external, foreign investors. This subjects them to the brutal volatility of the global financial weather. If international investors lose faith, they pull their capital out, the local currency collapses, and the nation defaults. Japan is not at the mercy of foreign investors, because Japan owes its debt almost entirely to itself. At the end of December 2024, of the total government debt balance of over 1,200 trillion yen, an astounding 88.1% was held domestically. The single largest holder of this debt is the government's own central bank. The Bank of Japan holds 46.3% of all outstanding Japanese government bonds. Behind them, domestic insurance companies hold 15.6%, and domestic commercial banks hold 14.5%. And how do those domestic banks have the sheer volume of cash required to buy all that debt? To understand that, you don't look at a Wall Street trading desk, you look at a local post office. This massive domestic absorption relies heavily on a financial leviathan entirely unique to Japan's history: the postal savings system. Established by the Meiji government back in 1875 to offer small volume deposit accounts, it was designed to promote savings among rural populations. It worked a little too well. The Japanese public has a culturally ingrained, incredibly high savings rate. Over the next century, the postal system grew into an absolute monster. By 1996, the Japanese Postal Savings Fund was literally the largest financial institution in the world. It held 213 trillion yen in assets, roughly 45% of the Japanese GDP at the time. It dwarfed massive private Western entities like Citicorp by a factor of 8. Today, Japan Post Bank continues to gather massive deposits through a dense network of local post offices across the country. As of 2019, those postal saving deposits amounted to approximately 181 trillion yen. These enormous pools of citizen life savings are funneled directly into purchasing Japanese government bonds. Effectively, the Japanese government is borrowing the life savings of its own grandmothers to fund the state. Furthermore, Japan issues this debt entirely in its own currency, the yen. Economic theory dictates that a sovereign nation that prints its own fiat currency and borrows exclusively in that currency faces exactly zero technical risk of insolvency. They literally own the printing press. They can always generate the necessary liquidity to honor their obligations, and they are backed by immense wealth. From 1991 until 2024, Japan consistently ranked as the world's largest creditor nation, with gross external assets reaching an astonishing 1,659 trillion yen. To sustain this massive mountain of debt without crippling the national budget, the Bank of Japan artificially controlled the financial weather. As the country fought persistent deflation, the central bank maintained aggressive monetary accommodation, keeping interest rates at or below zero. Japan carries a mountain of debt, but because the interest rate was practically zero, the cost of carrying that mountain remained incredibly light for over 20 years. It is an extreme, highly orchestrated financial fortress. But just across the sea, a very different kind of financial architecture was being built. And this one wasn't centralized at all. If Japan's debt is a transparent, clearly documented fortress, China's debt is a sprawling, subterranean labyrinth. As we established, Beijing's official central government debt sits at just 41.23 trillion yuan. It looks fantastic on paper. But anyone who deeply studies the Chinese economy knows that this official figure is, quite frankly, an accounting illusion. And to understand why, we have to look at a bureaucratic nightmare created 3 decades ago. The origins of China's modern debt crisis trace directly back to the comprehensive tax-sharing reforms implemented in 1994. At the time, the central government in Beijing was starved for cash and losing fiscal control. To survive, Beijing radically rewrote the tax code, re-centralizing a massive share of the country's tax revenue for itself. But while Beijing secured the money, they left the local governments with the bill. Local mayors and provincial leaders were still legally required to fund the majority of social services, schools, hospitals, and crucially, infrastructure development. Economists call this a massive vertical fiscal gap. Imagine you are a local mayor in China. The central government mandates that you must hit an aggressive 8% GDP growth target this year. If you fail, your political career is over. But Beijing also took most of your tax revenue. Furthermore, legally, your local government is prohibited from running a huge deficit. You are not authorized to issue municipal bonds directly or take direct loans from banks. You have the mandate to build, but no legal way to get the money. So, to survive, these mayors exploited a massive loophole. They established state-owned corporate shell entities known as local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs. Because an LGFV is technically structured as a corporate entity rather than a direct government body, it wasn't subject to the strict borrowing limits imposed on the state. A city could set up an LGFV, have that shadow company borrow billions of dollars from Chinese state banks, and then use that money to build the bridges, subways, and massive real estate developments that drove the Chinese economic miracle. Following the 2008 global financial crisis, central authorities panicked about a global slowdown and ordered local governments to flood the country with fiscal stimulus. The LGFVs went into overdrive. By the end of 2023, China possessed more than 3,200 of these shadow entities. The public bonds they issued represent just the visible tip of the iceberg. When you factor in opaque bank borrowing and broader shadow credit, the true scale of LGFV hidden debt is staggering. The International Monetary Fund estimates that by the end of 2024, LGFV hidden debt reached $9.04 trillion. Other financial data providers, compiling interest-bearing liabilities across roughly 4,000 LGFVs, put the total at $12.10 trillion US. To put that into perspective, the Rhodium Group estimated this hidden mass of debt was roughly twice the size of Germany's entire economy, completely off the official books. Under a broader measure called augmented debt, the IMF projects China's total debt burden will skyrocket to 148.2% of GDP by 2029. But the terrifying reality of the LGFV structure isn't just the sheer volume of the money. It's the catastrophic lack of commercial viability. Japan borrowed money at near 0% interest to sustain a wealthy, developed population. Chinese LGFVs borrowed money at high interest rates from shadow banks to build infrastructure that simply does not generate sufficient revenue to pay back the debt. Because investors blindly assumed Beijing would bail out any failing local government, interest rates did not reflect the massive risk. This moral hazard led to the greatest misallocation of capital in human history. Look at China's high-speed rail network. It is an unparalleled engineering marvel. But financially, it is incredibly fragile. In 2016, the revenue generated from China's entire high-speed rail network totaled 140.9 billion yuan. However, the interest payments alone on the debt used to construct that network amounted to 156.8 billion yuan. They built the greatest train network on Earth, but the ticket sales couldn't even cover the interest on the loans. You have to continually borrow more money just to pay the interest on the old money. Today, IMF findings indicate that only 3% of LGFVs post a return on equity of 4% or higher. Approximately 10% of them record outright bleeding losses. They are zombie corporations. This systemic rot became highly visible in heavily indebted regions like Zunyi City, located in the mountainous, less developed Guizhou province. By 2023, Guizhou's total debt pushed its debt-to-GDP ratio to an alarming 61.9%. Zunyi Road and Bridge, the largest city-owned LGFV, used local land as collateral to borrow heavily for infrastructure projects. But as the broader Chinese real estate sector collapsed, the music stopped. On December 30th, 2022, the inevitable happened. Zunyi Road and Bridge announced it could not repay a 15.6 billion yuan loan, about $2.24 billion US. The entity was forced into a desperate, humiliating restructuring agreement, extending the repayment over an unprecedented 20 years, with the first 10 years requiring only interest payments. No principal. The crisis laid bare a terrifying landscape: half-finished roads, empty flats, and a local government desperately missing payments to contractors and civil servants. How did this unstable system survive for 30 years? It relied on a single, fragile revenue drug: land sales. In China, urban land is state-owned. To fund their operations and service their mounting debt, LGFVs relied on selling and leasing land rights to massive private property developers like Evergrande. In 2019, a staggering 38% of local government revenue in China came directly from land-backed financing. But when the Chinese property market entered a severe downturn, exacerbated by strict regulatory crackdowns from Beijing to cool the housing bubble, the revenue engine stalled completely. Land sales to property developers plummeted by 53% in 2022. Overall land sales revenue contracted by 35% in 2023 compared to 2021 levels. Without the continuous speculative appreciation of land, the LGFVs found themselves entirely devoid of the cash flow necessary to service their multi-trillion-dollar obligations. The shadow banking machine had hit a brick wall. Neither the Japanese nor the Chinese financial architectures are immortal. Right now, both systems are reaching their absolute breaking points, strained by the very macroeconomic policies engineered to sustain them over the last 30 years. For Japan, the existential threat is the return of the very phenomenon they spent 3 decades attempting to engineer: inflation. After years of near-zero interest rates and persistent deflation, global macroeconomic shocks and domestic wage hikes have finally brought sustained inflation back to Japan. The economy has reached a new equilibrium, and, in response, the era of free money has definitively ended. The Bank of Japan has been forced to gradually normalize its monetary policy, abandoning negative interest rates. In January 2025, the central bank executed a historic policy shift, raising its basic loan rate to 0.75%. A fraction of a percent sounds microscopic, but it carries catastrophic mathematical consequences when applied to a 1.3 quadrillion yen debt pile. When a government holds debt equal to roughly 235% of its GDP, even a tiny increase in interest rates means the state must suddenly allocate a massive chunk of its tax revenue simply to pay the interest on its own bonds. Analytical models indicate that every 1% increase in average borrowing costs adds approximately 3.6 trillion yen to Japan's annual debt service. That is an amount equivalent to 0.7% of the nation's entire GDP vanishing into thin air every single year. This is actively degrading the government's fiscal capacity right now. In the Japanese government's fiscal 2026 budget, the amount of money allocated simply to servicing the national debt increased by nearly 11% to reach a record 31.3 trillion yen. For China, the systemic threat is entirely different. It faces a deflationary death spiral fueled by the collapse of the LGFV shadow banking system. To curb the reckless, debt-fueled expansion of the real estate sector, Beijing instituted strict regulatory measures like the 3 red lines policy. But because real estate development and local land sales were the primary engines driving Chinese municipal finance, the crackdown inadvertently destroyed developer balance sheets, stalled broader economic growth, and left local governments completely unable to pay back their shadow debt. This macroeconomic divergence is perfectly illustrated by the bond markets. In a historic, shocking inversion, China's 10-year and 30-year government bond yields actually fell below Japan's equivalents for the first time since the early 2000s. Historically, China's high growth and inflation commanded a yield premium over Japan. Today, the inversion signals that China has become the low-yield anchor of Asia, dragged down by disinflation, weak nominal growth, and fears of a brutal balance sheet recession. Japan and China, the two great titans of the Asian century, present two fundamentally opposing macroeconomic answers to the challenge of financing the modern state. Japan chose to socialize its debt. The government utilized the absolute cultural trust of its own citizens, funneling their postal savings and commercial bank deposits into a heavily fortified, closed-loop ecosystem managed meticulously by the central bank. They built a multi-trillion-dollar cushion, accepting 3 decades of zero interest rates and economic stagnation to gently, comfortably manage the slow decline of an aging, wealthy superpower. It is a system that relies entirely on internal stability, and it is now facing its ultimate stress test as inflation finally forces interest rates off the floor. China, conversely, chose to weaponize its debt. Facing strict central borrowing quotas but desperate to hit politically mandated growth targets, local mayors utilized a vast, subterranean shadow banking system to finance the fastest economic miracle in human history. They paved a continent in concrete, funding the expansion with high-yield, off-the-books financing vehicles backed by the perpetual appreciation of local land prices. But that debt was frequently allocated to projects that generate absolutely no economic return, building massive bridges over empty valleys and high-speed rail lines to remote regions that cannot even cover their own interest payments. Japan proved that a nation can survive a mathematically impossible amount of debt, even 235% of its GDP, if it owes the money to itself, borrows in its own sovereign currency, and has the immense accumulated wealth of a fully developed nation to fall back on. China is about to test what happens when an unprecedented mountain of shadow debt collides with a collapsing real estate market, attempting to service a developed world debt load with a rapidly aging developing world population. The official numbers on the ledger only ever tell half the story. The true, terrifying paradox of Asian debt lies not in the billions borrowed, but in identifying who is ultimately left holding the liability when the music stops and the macroeconomic cycle inevitably turns.